Okay, let us be getting started. Hello, everyone. Very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Almaty Cluster Bureau of UNESCO. Today, our Bureau is having the last webinar of this kind this year that is dedicated to culture and creative industries. And in this regard, we looked at various aspects and sides of the process of managing these creative industries together with international experts who regularly cooperate with UNESCO on the topic of Convention of 2005 on protection and encouraging cultural expression industries. So hopefully these workshops have been useful for you and will be useful for you in the future for those who work on the development of the creative industries in your countries. Just in case, would like to remind you that the recordings of all of the previous workshops and today's workshop those published at our YouTube channel. Right now, there is a link in the chat box, so you can check the recordings of our previous workshops if you care. So moving down to the topic of our today's workshop, that sounds like this: UNESCO Convention 2005, and it's well, basically coexistence with the other frameworks. Ms. Hiroko Tsuboi-Friedman will be speaking today. She will introduce herself. She is the member of the Expert Center of UNESCO since 2005. She is also a Deputy Director on International Issues of the Secretariat on Science of Japan and Senior Researcher on Political Issues responsible for the international exchanges to promote the policy of cohesive society under the Cabinet of Ministers of Japan. So I'm just like to pass the floor to Ms. Tsuboi-Friedman. And of course, you can ask your questions, react to the presentations via chat. At the end of the presentation, I will pass all of your questions to Ms. Hiroko. Hiroko, over to you.
Good day, good afternoon. My name is Hiroko Tsuboi-Friedman. As I was currently introduced, my name, I'm an expert facility member of the UNESCO 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. I'm also serving as a Deputy Director for International Affairs, Science Council of Japan Secretariat, Cabinet Office, and some other board of council for local municipalities as well, and organizations mainly related to arts and culture promotion. And my, just for the introduction, my academic disciplines and backgrounds are art history and sociology, cultural anthropology, and so forth. But today I am actually talking in my own individual capacity as an expert facility member of the 2005 convention. So today's topic is about balancing talks about culture. It is about UNESCO 2005 convention. But I would like to talk about this from three aspects. One is, of course, about the 2005 convention, but with other international frameworks, and lastly, the discourses, just various discourses, in terms of the academic talks, and some other, the social issues, of discourses as well. So now arts and culture, are they necessary? Was the often talked topic, especially during the pandemic, the lockdowns, and in this case, for Japan, it was a state of emergency. It was called because there was no legal force, to make it a lockdown, basically. So for us in Japan, it was a state of emergency, meaning gentle but strong request or advice by the government. So under the situation, many cultural workers, of course, were completely impacted, for their business and their activities, and there were lots of protests in Japan as well, just to survive, even to this day. And many times there was this slogan, if you think artists are useless, try to spend your quarantine time without music, without books, poems, movies, and paintings, and so forth. This was done, uploaded and posted by the writer Stephen King from the States, and it became vastly popular in Japan as well, like circulated around. So here's actually a very good example of like, what these core industries like, or the core essence like, of like, what is going on like, with the creative economy and with the cultural and creative industries. And like, the truth is they are all vital, and they are very useful and valuable and essential like, for our well-being. And of course, like accessibility, like it was another thing that was talked about. Yes, so like, during this course, like over state of emergency, like the mild lockdowns, some of the courses I teach, like at the universities, there's I conducted some surveys, along the way, and the question was, what is culture to you? And some of the answers were quite interesting, so I thought it could be of your interest to see what kind of key words came out of this of this situation. So we're here we can see, of course, in the arts, and lifestyle, social norms and customs, creativities, but essentials to our lives, and everything created by human beings, diversity, individuality, wisdoms and knowledge, and and the source of energies, and the force force. What was interesting also, were also the balance between individual and the public. This person was talking about the relationships, and its balance, and identity, of course, was another big topic that came out. Someone also said programmed or embedded in our hearts and body. So it is basically the essence, that we are actually recognizing at the moment. So, talking about the culture, is definitely the starting point, I think, to talk about the creative industries and the creative economies. But this word culture, is a somewhat difficult thing to tackle, because the definition of culture can be different from place to place and from time to time. So I just thought, I would share, this aspect, from Japanese, point of view, it's just drawing your attention on the origin, and also the background, of the word culture, in this topic. The meaning, what you see now on the screen, is calligraphy, it's kind of bizarre calligraphy. I just did it, on the spot. But it says bunka, bunka, and together, these are two Chinese characters, which we are using in even today's contemporary Japanese the writings. The bun and the ka together, it actually means writing and to change. So together, bunka actually means to teach and lead, or guide, the people through writing, through literature. It's and the Japanese language, largest kanji, the Japanese dictionary, actually says to indoctrinate the people without the use of punishment. Which is actually quite interesting, because this phrase, what we use, often we can see at schools as well, called bunbu ryodo, meaning bun, the writing, and bun, the military arts or the martial arts, both of them should be accomplished, or achieved, or often the slogan or or the mottos, in frames, at the schools, so we can actually see. So that's still an interesting one, I think. So how this culture, the notion have developed, especially in the modern period. We like to look into this, and here we see the Meiji period, which started from 1868 to 1912. That was actually the time that the Japan, for the long time, over 300 years, have closed its doors to the world, had finally opened and start to officially and openly start to exchange ideas the culturally, socially, economically as well. And here, like in the recent, like I pointed out three, like the examples like from the dictionaries. Culture, like like here, like on the top says, like it's by the James Carter Hepburn, by the way. Like like his dictionary, like it became quite well known because he was a American missionary to Japan, like and who introduced like this the Romanized spelling, like the letters, like that we use now, and formulated into Japanese, like to be used. So like here, like at the time, like he translated culture like as learning, education, and elegance. Like and it's interesting in a way because at the time, like the Hepburn used like this word culture, like and actually showed like that like it's different. Like what he thought was culture, like it was these three words, like it was quite different from what we conceive as culture now. So I thought that was interesting now, like understanding that the English language itself has changed like from that time. The second part, like I said, Westernization movement, like so like with the curiosity, like the bunka, like the word culture was used, like concept, with a link to the Westernization, like and the culture of West and the movement itself in Japan as well. And then the third one, like is from like another dictionary called Genkai. Like Genkai actually means the ocean of language or words. And like I thought that was interesting. But like but this one like it says like literally like indoctrination. So like more like like link with the Chinese characteristics, like and the Chinese classic like roots. And at the same time, like around this time, like we can see the culture was not exactly distinguished, like from civilizations, like in the past. Later on, we'll see like where it starts to part, like the material aspects, like and spiritual aspects of culture. And here, like the second stage was like the era called Taisho and Showa, like like from 1912 to 1926. To Showa 1926 to 1989. So the German, like this is where like the German, like the language, like and like the concept of culture start to coming into Japan and being introduced. So like here's some words like like explained like like with the roots and like in German as well. So we see cultivations, material civilizations, and the culture here, like directly, which I actually find interesting here, I think. So as I said, like the concept of civilizations, like like started to be differentiated like around this time. And then, like from Taisho, like like in 1912 to 1926 to Showa, like one era before, like the current one is called like in 1926 to 1989. And here, like like we can actually start to see like some of the daily use, like like semantic usage, like are like starting to be incorporated into dictionaries, like like for disseminations. And here we can actually see like to open up the word and make it better, like for betterment and improvement, the process of life, like in which nature like is purified and ideals like are realized, or products of this process of learning, art, morality, religion, law, and economics. And number three, to be westernized still, or to be new, like to be different, like that was in 1925. And then culture, like later on in 1943 in Showa period, like it says to open up the world, still it's there. A spiritual activity, like that uses nature as a material to realize ideals or humanity. So these different concepts that are going to start to be formed, you can see. And also like the number two, number three, the spiritual activities that use nature as a material to realize. I'm sorry, that was the duplication. like number three is being obsessed with the West. So still like it's about us and them, like kind of like the otherness and like and self, like or contrast, like which like is leads into like this whole idea about the soft diplomacy, like the strategies, like or like or the cultural diplomacies, like later on, but like we can actually see the roots here, even like in this kind of, like the expressions, like or like or the ideas in the dictionaries as well. So now, like, moving on to like a little bit of the rights, the fundamental human rights issues. Here, the cultural rights or rights for culture, I wrote, and like in the Japanese Constitution, like which came into effect in May, like 3rd, 1947. So this is still the time, like like Japan was under occupation, like so the U.S. like occupation, was actually like the major like impacts and influence like onto like, the formation of this Japanese Constitution after the World War II. And here, like, I put it, Article 25, it says, like, the cultured living. All people shall have the right to maintain the minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living. Like, it's an interesting notion because it was actually the first time, like, in any constitution in the world, like, this idea and the word expression culture or culture related has appeared. So it's like and even to this day, like this in Japanese, like the interpretation of this phrase, like cultured living, like is in discussion, like in link, like with link to the cultural rights. And of course, like later on, like a year later, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into effect, and came in. The Article 27 actually was the one about the right to cultural, artistic, and social, scientific life, like which I will talk about a little bit later. And of course, like some other issues, like related to the cultural rights were the International Covenants on Human Rights. Adopted like in 1966, and then came into the force in 1976, and then the Social Rights Covenant, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 15 guarantees to everyone the right to take part in cultural, cultural life. Now, these things are, very well, punctuated and stressed, in the special rapporteur, on the cultural right issues, reports, in various other, documents as well, even to this day. So, just coming back to the Japanese, the cultural policy a little bit, to reflect, on the formation of the, of the idea culture, and also, the cultural rights, issues in the constitutions. For the Japanese cultural policy, the basic acts on promotion of culture and the arts, was enacted, in 2001. Until then, there wasn't any, formed, an idea, of the, of the act, or any, legal, frameworks, but this, was a concrete, effort and initiative to move, and use, arts and culture, in strategic ways. And then later on, the partial revision of the basic acts on promotion of culture and arts came out, in 2017, and a year later, in order to implement, the basic plan on promotion of culture and arts, that came out. And the reason and aim, for this, was because of the rapid social change, including the decline in birth rates, an aging society, and globalization call for, for further measurement to create a comprehensive culture and arts policy that promotes collaboration among a diverse range of relevant fields, including tourism, local development, and international exchanges. This is actually done by the Agency for Cultural Affairs, in Japan. The second scope, of reason and aim, was, of course, we all remember, the Olympics and Paralympic Games, this summer, the Tokyo 2020 game. So, at that time, this basic plan was formed. It was one of the target. This game is regarded as both a sports and cultural festival. So it is a significant opportunity for Japan to disseminate its culture and arts for the international community, and a chance for for the nation to demonstrate creating new values through culture and arts. That was the aim. So, to get into these things, they were actually linked, to the English documents, at the Agency for Cultural Affairs of the Japanese government. I can always, share the link later on. But, here, in the preamble, of this, we can clearly see, what the government wanted to pay attention to, which was arts and culture. And under this, this line, it says culture and arts, including music, drama, dance, film, animation, manga, brings sensation and the joy of living to us and enrich our lives. The arts are at the same time a strong driving force in revitalizing society at large. Arts and culture play a vital role in our lives. So clearly, the government was trying to use those items of the core industries in CCI, the culture and creative industries, what we call now. So in order to promote the arts and culture of Japan, the Agency for Cultural Affairs is dedicated to promoting of media arts such as film and animation and manga, providing supports to creative work, including music, film, dance, and other dramatic arts, fostering young and upcoming artists, reinforcing opportunity for children's arts and culture experience, providing supports to arts and cultural activities in local communities, and hosting the Japan, Japan Media Arts Festival and some other festivals, using those as an opportunity and taking momentum to the core. So this leading to the what we call the soft power diplomacy, the cool Japan strategy, which is targeted and one of the critical aspects of the cultural development and the CCI development, and the creative economy. You can see the targets and the idea here, examine way to promote and strengthen the public and private in the partnership to industrialize the strength of Japanese culture and tradition, and to sell and promote internationally. So the government is desperately trying to portray a certain image of Japan, and its efforts is quite strong. And these are actually done by the various entities within the government. The first one is of course the Cabinet Office, which I work with. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, and the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology. And the Agency for Cultural Affairs, which I have been mentioning about, is a part of the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technologies. We do not have an individual entity, the Ministry of Culture yet, but there are strong movements, to actually push and promote and encourage the government to have the Ministry of the Culture alone standing. So coming back to this the creative economy, which we kept talking about, what is actually the creative economy? And it is much focused in today's talks of economics. There is no definitive definition. There is no single ones actually, which is quite interesting even to this day. So that's why I say shaky definitions, ongoing concept in the making. So according to United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, it says this, as you can see. Oh, sorry. No single definition, involving concepts which builds on the interplay between human creativities and ideas and intellectual property, knowledge, and technology. Essentially, it is the knowledge-based economic activities upon which the creative industries are based. And here, we can actually see that most of the key target industries within within the culture and the creative economy, or slash sector slash industries, such as advertising, architecture, arts and crafts, design, fashion, film, video, etc. So it really is intertwined, and interconnects, among these industries as a whole. And of course, these industries among the most dynamic sectors, the most rapidly growing sectors in the world economy, providing new opportunity for developing countries, especially to leapfrog into emerging high growth areas of world economy. And of course, this year, 2021, we have are celebrating everywhere the International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development. And what was interesting, I thought, was very strong initiative taken by the Asia Pacific area. The Indonesia actually was the key driver and sponsor of the proposal. And the presentation was done by the group countries such as Australia, China, India, Indonesia, Mongolia, Philippines, and Thailand. So as we can see, and of course we talked about over and over, Asia Pacific, for creative economy, the attention and impact is huge. So now I'm going to move on to the UNESCO's publication, the pamphlet, which came out in 2018, Investing in Creativity. And I do think this is the most comprehensive pamphlet to this day, of this convention. So that's why I'm mentioning this. And also, this is available in 7 languages, on the convention website. And the Japanese one, I finished translation, and now it's posted also. And I must add that for disseminations and effective awareness raising of the convention, the language barrier is really big. As we always talk about, with my colleagues and others. And especially this language barrier is quite a big thing in Asia Pacific in the region, where the linguistic diversity is so big. We're talking about more than 2,000 to 3,000 languages in 28 language linguistic families. Anyways, coming back to this, for this region, now it's available in Tagalog and Japanese. So we can actually, go to the link and download in 7 languages now. So when you open the pamphlet, this starts with the basic figures on the culture and creative industries, CCI. And it is, as I said, it's the fastest growing in the world. And with estimated growth worth 4.3 trillion US dollars per year. The culture sector now accounts for 6.1% of the global economy. They generate annual revenue of the US dollars 2,250 billion US dollars, and nearly 30 billion. 30 million new jobs worldwide. And especially the interesting aspect is it employs more people, young people, between the age 15 to 29, more than any other sector, which is important. Also, for the Asia Pacific, where the young, the population is the booster. So the CCI, the cultural and creative industries, have become essential, like, for inclusive economic growth, reducing inequalities and achievement, like, achieving the goals set up, like in the 2030, like, sustainable development agenda. So, and at the time, like, this publication came out in 2018, like, the creative economy accounted for 3% of the global GDP. And now we're talking about, like, like only growing, like in this upward trend, like, which is a very big one. And as I said, like, this is also, like, the major driver for developing, like, and strategy for many countries. And over the past 2 decades, the culture and creative industries have to evolve dramatically. And this is especially so for the developing countries, where there's a deep reliance on informal cultural systems and processes and institutions that may leave many artists and cultural professionals beyond the reach of governments, regulations, and investment opportunities. And for some countries, like, they can even make up to like 10% of the GDP. So, like, the current situations, like, maybe, like, this might have been repeated, by other, like, the members, like, of the speakers, but adoption of the 2005 convention, like, was a milestone in international cultural policies, like, and right now, like, in 151, when I checked with the headquarters, like, last month, like, this was the number given to me, like 150, parties, like, with one, like, like EU, like, European Union. And so this, like, historic agreements, like, the global community formally recognized the multifaceted nature, cultural, social, and economic, and contemporary, like, cultural expressions produced by artists and cultural professionals. And we start to talk about the accessibility, and, like, in others as well, like, the supply chains and so forth. And it recognized the rights of parties to take measures to protect and promote diversity of cultural expressions, and imposes obligations, like, at both domestic and international levels on parties. It also provides a plan of actions that ensure artists, cultural professionals, and creative practitioners, and importantly, all citizens, have the capacity to create, produce, disseminate, and enjoy a broad range of cultural goods and services and activities. So now, like, just focusing on the Asia Pacific, like, for the session, like, the first one to ratify was India back in 2006, and the most recent one, like, was Turkmenistan in, like, 2021, very recent one. But the concern, like, is the Asia Pacific, is a region underrepresented compared to any other regions. As of like, 2021, now, like, 19 out of 46 member states of UNESCO in the Asia Pacific region have ratified the convention, and it is the lowest, like, rate of ratification. And Japan, including also, Japan has not ratified, and a lack of awareness and understanding about the convention and its relevance hinders its widespread ratification, and also its impacts and effort to benefit from, especially innovation. And I think that's another one that we need to talk about. So currently, like, in Bangladesh, Mongolia, and Vietnam are the intergovernmental committee members from the group for, like, in Asia Pacific region. So we can see, and so once, like, you ratify, like, those periodic reports, like, are the very good, gauge, like, to see the implementation and the condition around, like, around the culture and the cultural policy of each countries. For monitoring and adequate implementation, the periodic reports are due every 4 years. And these reports are not only, as I said, good indicator, but the good information, good information monitoring scheme. And the interesting and the very important aspects of this is because of the many stakeholders have to get involved, especially the civil society organizations, to work with the government, is a very unique and important aspect of it. And so since the adoption of the convention, the international community is increasingly acknowledging the contribution of the cultural sector to sustainable development, situating the culture and the creative industries, CCI, are as essential means to achieve inclusive economic growth and social cohesion. So the guiding principles and the values that underpin the conventions are these followings. Number one, the sovereign rights of states adopt the implement policies to promote the diversity of cultural expressions that are based on informed, transparent, and participatory processes and system of governance. The equitable access, openness, and balance in the flow of cultural goods, service, as well as the free movement of artists and cultural professionals, mobility. Number three is the recognition of the complementary economic and cultural aspects of sustainable development. Number four, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedom of expression, information, and communication, as a prerequisite for the creation, distribution, and enjoyment of diverse cultural expressions. So here's the monitoring framework. It's a big chart, and we can actually see it, from the other sources. It's small, I'm sorry to say, but the cultural and the creative industry have become essential, for inclusive economic growth, reducing inequalities, and achieving goals set out in the 2030 agenda, sustainable development goals. So they go side by side, the convention effort. So the monitoring framework is designed as a dynamic tool to support monitoring the convention over time, to inform policy decisions and guide the collection of data and information. So this data and information collection is a very important aspect, because as I said, since this is a very unique and very important convention for cultural policies, cultural policy in academia, we rely on these data collections, we feed each other in many ways, So once again, the link with Agenda 2030, the monitoring framework emphasizes the link between the implementation of the convention and achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And you can see what is really the keys to it really links with all 17 goals, but especially these are some of the target ones that they can easily point out, as we can see. And here's the impact through just three monitoring outputs, quadrennial periodic report, global report is another one, excuse me, and the policy monitoring platform, the last one. The objective is to generate an enabling environment for the reshaping of cultural policies, to promote fundamental freedoms and the diversity of cultural expressions. There are the tools and outputs of the project that can generate and contribute to implement the process, such as awareness raising, capacity building, knowledge production, platform for dialogues, information sharing, and network development, as you can see. And by collecting and analyzing data and information, elaborating innovative tools and sustainable participation process, countries that are inspired to design or redesign their cultural policies to be in line with the goals of the convention and the SDGs. And for Asia Pacific, experts are working on mapping out some interesting initiatives in response to the convention. There are some cases coming from Central Asia, Central Asia to the Pacific. So I think this data collection side is a very important aspect as well. So coming back to the scope of the Asia Pacific, UNESCO member states count for 46. And it's a vast and very rich in variety region, as we all know. In Asia Pacific, in particular, East Asia is a hotspot for creative economy, as they call it, with a combined size of the US dollars, 26.2 trillion, or the 30% of the world GDP. And it's a very city dense, meaning many people can live in congregates in the city, and the city livings. And as I said, young population rich, except for some super Asian countries like Japan and Korea, of course. And as I said, the culture and creative industries, CCI, are the world's most rapidly growing economic sectors. And Asia really is the focus at the moment. Even according to UNCTAD, the Asian region exceeds all other regions as well. For example, with China, being the world's biggest art and film market, Asia accounts for 228, $8 billion US of creative exports, which is double size, of that of Europe. And Republic of Korea provides numerous very interesting and innovative examples of cultural policies shaping and developed along with the the 2005 convention. And Japan has not ratified yet, but clearly, being conscious of the convention. And the creative economy development is definitely is in the national agenda and interest. So the government pays attention on the potential and national branding and the promise and bringing up the soft power diplomacy discourses. So it was back in 2010 that the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry established the Cool Japan Overseas Strategy Office. And China and Korea in particular, as I said, are the interesting ones that the many the academic studies are going after. So just one aspect on the internet, intellectual property, looking into WIPO, the worst innovative economies in the Global Innovation Index 2020, the last year one, came out like this. Singapore, Republic of Korea, and Hong Kong, this may change, after, the Chinese influence, from the, on the topic, excuse me. And the central, in Southern Asia, it was India, Iran, and Kazakhstan, were listed. So in terms of the international frameworks, now looking into the economic frameworks, of course, there's RCEP, that came out, with around the Pacific, but beyond, so so I just decided to mention this here also, with the 15 countries now, it really is going to be the largest trade agreement, in terms of the GDP, so we cannot really ignore its impact. And of course, with the 2005 convention, it's going to be more with intellectual property, but we have to really talk about the impacts of the creative economy at large, as a wholesome topic here. So So here, like, we talk, like, we can talk about, like, how large, like, the impacts, like, of the economy, but, like, we can also, like, looking into, like, some of the details here too, the South-South corporations, type of aspects, like, the human mobility, like, it was greatly impacted, like, and the, the work, the labor force, like, shift, like, is like completely impacted. Like, the wage structures, the competitiveness, and the capacity building, so, like, are going to be the challenged, and, like, and should be reconsidered. And because of the lack of awareness of the 2000 convention, like in Asia Pacific areas, like in the region in particular, and the low rate of ratification in the region, the free trade agreement, like, rarely include, like, the mention of the convention or cultural exemption, like, or, like, clause, like, or any other, like, the measures dedicated to promote and protecting the diversity of cultural expressions. Article 16, like, in particular, like, of the convention. And of course, like, there are some agreements, like, and a few countries protecting, like, the cultural industries according to the convention. For example, like, FTA between, like, European Union and the Republic of Korea is one of the very few, like, that include an explicit mentioning, like, of the convention, 2005 convention, and refer to the specificity of cultural goods and our services. So this agreement also includes the preferential treatment costs for cultural goods and services, and improves the protection of intellectual property rights in Korea. So this is actually something to look into. Also, like, the New Zealand and and other, like, is another, like, Asia Pacific countries that stands out for the crowd, by granting the culture sector specific provisions in some of the FTAs. Like, now the New Zealand has 17 co-production agreements, including one with China. I thought that was a good one too. So now ideology, like, ideology and equilibrium, the basis of cooperation within the region. So Asia Pacific, is a hotspot, yes, but at the same time, like, a geopolitical aspect, like, the geopolitical climate, like, is another big concern as well. The various frameworks, like, based on, like, strengthening diplomatic ties. So, like, now we're talking about, the Quad, quadrilateral, like, security dialogues, amongst, like, in United States, Japan, Australia, and India, like, over the Asia, like, in Asian Central, the ASEAN, like, with the Myanmar, like, is, becoming, like, an issue here too. The free and open Indo-Pacific, like, this is not just, like, for, like, for the Pacific, like, and ocean side, of course, like, it goes, like, and impacts, like, with one belt, one road, like, by China, like, this initiative as well. So there are many, like, various, like, lines of frameworks, like, that we can, like, pay attention to when we talk about culture. And, like, when we talk about the, this kind of, like, diplomatic relationship, I just thought, like, I'll just touch on bilateral one too. Like, well, like, multilateral, but the regional ones, like, Central Asia plus Japan dialogue, which actually came out, like, way back, like, in 2004, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And, like, it was, like, to foster, like, the cooperation with the Central Asian countries, as you can see, like, these, like, 5 countries, like, in Central Asia. And, like, it was, like, to support, like, open, stable, and independent development of Central Asia, and contributing to regional and international peace and stability as a catalyst for the development, like, of regional cooperation. And recently, last year, like, in summer, like, teleconference, like, of foreign ministers, like, was held actually to boost up again. And, like, there, like, they talked about the intra-regional cooperation in Central Asia and cooperation with Japan in combining, like, new coronary infections. Like, of course, the pandemic is the major, like, topic everywhere. the nature of cooperation with the view of 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations in 2022. So within the frameworks of the Central Asia and Japan dialogues, there are different, various, initiatives, by foreign ministers, or the expat meetings, the business dialogues, and so forth are held. So it's becoming another hot topic here too. And this is just a pamphlet, that came out, as a promotion too. And we can see, what they were trying to focus here. I thought, it was interesting to show. So, this pamphlet, when you open, it would start with all the country profiles, of each countries. And going through here is the partnership. Economic cooperation, of course. And here is the cultural topic. And again, we can see, the focuses are actually on what heritage, souvenirs, and food, so clearly targeting tourism, as one of the key main aspects, of the tie. So now, talking about, the international frameworks that, with, focus on the convention of 2000 convention, this is a timeline, of significant events around the culture, at the international level. So, especially from 1972, the convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. As I mentioned, before, the word heritage, is actually the one of the most successful, or one of the popular conventions, to this day. It was a word by Dr. Matsuda, actually, the former Director General of the UNESCO, of the days. And from there, from 1972 on, the culture debates, was really developed. Of course, back in the 60s, it was also a hot topic, but it really accelerated, with these type of international effort that you can see. And the 2000, up to 2005, 2001, the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity and the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, and in 2003, the Convention for Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and 2004, the UNESCO Creative Cities Network. They're very important ones, especially when we talk about the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression, 2005. This UNESCO Creative Cities Network is the very important one, because the Creative Cities Network talk about the local at the multiple level aspect, the efforts with the cultural assets, and often encourage to link with the 2005 convention, to promote and protect the diversity of cultural expressions. So, the 2005 convention, there are many aspects of, with the CCIs, of course, the global discussion on the creative economy found momentum in 1990s, when global pressures stories over a mainly defensive approach within the global landscape, marked by the rapid shift towards globalization market economy. The increasing commodification of culture raised particular concern too. That was also the topic, but especially so, and then the convention was grown out of the trade disputes, as many of you are aware already, mainly Canada and France versus the United States, back in 1990s. So the decline and influence and the function of the World Trade Organization shifted discussion of international legal frameworks to UNESCO, and then the commodification of and culture trade, stimulation of creative economy, the cultural diversity, those, discussions really were fostered around it. But at this point, we all often say, the Article 20 of the Convention, the relationships to other treaties and mutual supportive, complementary, and each is not subordinate to each other, meaning that there is no risk, basically. So now looking into the merits, of the convention, I list these, up, from national brandings to more for the domestic impacts, such as respect for human rights or building cohesive society, or fostering diversity, diversity and tolerance and so forth. So this is as I said, Japan has not ratified the convention, but but we do think that the strong merits of the ratification of this convention is at all levels, from local to national and national to international. So this is something that we can all focus and talk about. For the part, for the people who have, of the party who have ratified or yet to ratify, because there are so many synergies, of discussing diversity of cultural expressions within the frameworks, of strengthening the culture and creative sector, and and economic and social and cultural impact. So the wholesomeness, is another aspect that we can always talk about. And back to the whole definition or idea concepts around the culture and arts, and some other issues as well. And this is so because of the process around the convention and the domestic policies and other international frameworks and initiatives. Once you ratify, of course, development of national legislation, or vice versa, and then application to the life of people and exercise in international community and at the domestic level too. So something like aspects such as fundamental human rights as I mentioned earlier, is is quite important. So that's why I'm just listening here, that the something to talk about is always in this foundation of the human rights issues, and which also of course mention about the culture and the cultural rights. And here too, the Article 27 is something that I mentioned when I talked about the Japanese Constitution, of 1947. So with this, this is just 2005 Convention preambles, because these are really the core. We often focus on this the usage of the convention, but when we talk about the basic idea, of course we have to come back to preambles and objectives, so they are here. We can always download and see, just celebrating the diversity of cultural expressions and objectives. So now, just moving on to the different discourses, or different aspects of the perspectives, to deal with the culture, when coming back to talking to the people outside of the cultural domain or the sectors, what is culture? Is it about you or is it about us? Interpretation, reinterpretations, translations and new translations. These things are actually, quite the topic, even with the people outside of the sectors as well, and of course in sectors. And I just wanted to to touch on some of the initiatives from the academic aspect, since I I do work with with academia, as a part of the Science Council of Japan, work too. like, the academy, like, for the G20 and also like in G7 as well, like, those countries have like got together and like and signed 2 joint statements, like, on pressing global issues to be addressed. Like, it was a science, like, in 20 and the social science and humanities, like, 20, like, those 2 different, groups, like, by the disciplines, like, came out like with the various statements. So 2 statements, like one by like the social science, excuse me, the science 20, like, the title, like, the pandemic preparedness and the role of science, and the SSH 20, like, social science and humanities 20 academies came out like with a statement entitled Crisis, Economy, Society, Law, and Culture Towards a Less Vulnerable Humankind. Like, and they were delivered like, to the G20 heads of the states and the government, as a statement and proposal, like, to potentially impact the policies. So academies like of SSA 20, like in the social science and humanities, and like in the G20 countries like address like, on the topics like global challenges and opportunities from crisis, fragilities and resilience towards the less vulnerable humankind, action map, global coordination for systematic crisis, education and research, and like and the cultural heritage. Cultural heritage actually was one like in a big section, like which was nice to see, and the social policy and legal harmonizations and economic actions. And and this type of efforts, like the wholesome approaches is very important now. Like so what you see now, like is the picture, like of the demonstration, the protest on streets in Japan back in summer against the Olympics. Like and like I said, fostering international cooperation through cultural exchange, international festival. Now, international festival, of course, is one of the, the key like events, like when it comes to like the CCIs, like or the creative economy, But as we see, like the Olympic, like especially this year, was in a big discussion. And like which actually went in parallel, like parallel, like with like with this like the G20, like SSH 20 statements, like while I was working, So IOC, like International Olympic Committee, of course, claims that and is a non-profit, like independent international organization that is committed to building a better world through sports. That is their mission and vision. And the Tokyo 2020 Olympics was supposed to be like a showcase display, the Japanese goodness, like what Japan is proud of, But with the pandemic, and it was like an X-raying the country, like showing the various challenges, like and hidden problems, like and challenges, like they all came up, like to the surface, like including like the lack of understanding of basic human rights. Like with regard to, like I'm talking about like all the backlash like to against like the tennis player like the Naomi Osaka and some other the racial discrimination like the incidents occurred like during this time. So we really have to talk about like what is it for and for food, like the cultural events, cultural like activities, the cultural industries, and the culture like as a whole. Like it was supposed to be like the Olympic, like was supposed to be the biggest showcase of Japanese culture, like and arts and culture. But the last poll, like right before the opening, like in July, showed 55% of respondents said they opposed to the Olympic, to be held, and 68% was expressing doubts about the organizers' ability to control infections. So doubts, towards the government, and organizations was shown. So what is it for? So for the aspects, when we deal with culture, it really is a Pandora box, I often call it. And although, like, we majorly talk about the benefits and positive aspects of culture, like, especially in the context, like, of the CCI or the creative economy, there are various concerns, like, and the different perspectives and discourses against the commodification of culture and culture, or the current trend of attitude towards culture, like, focusing on the economic aspect. So here I'm just going to have a quote from Jean Dufay. He was an artist who promoted an art route from France. And this is just a quote from 1968 as you can see on culture. And so around that time, recalling the formation of cultural policy, and any international frameworks and conventions, of and for culture, the late 68, was a time that the French, the minister, or the French government, was taking such strong initiative, with the cultural policy. So I thought it was interesting, to have what was against in this regard, suffocating culture. Culture is suffocating. Is completely the opposition stance of the culture, policy trend at the time. So art, culture, or creativity, what is it for, and is this current topic, and the direction, is this really okay? We have to keep thinking and question, anytime, in the process. So the last one, I think I'll end my talk, excuse me, with this one last point, because this one actually just came out, I think it was 2 days ago. Tug of war, between acceptable diversity and unacceptable difference, is what I titled, but this it's it's about already extinct Japanese wolf, the last Japanese wolf was captured back in 1905, it was caught and trapped by a hunter and beaten to death, and the body of the wolf, an Englishman Malcolm Anderson bought it and sent it back to England, where he was from. And so now the specimen is now preserved and displayed at the British museums. And there are only 4, remaining, specimens, in museums globally. And in the past, in Japan, wolves were actually seen and regarded as God in Japan. There were even shrines, everywhere, in this country, dedicated to wolves. However, in the Meiji era, the turn of the century, when the modernizations and westernizations started to occur, this new idea, that the wolves were actually evil, not the deity, not God, that was brought into Japan, and along with the Western civilizations and culture. So until then, there was no stock farming, in the custom in Japan. But when it was it started, the images of stories like Little Red Riding Hood or the wolf with 7 little goats, the wolves are evils, wolves are bad, this type of negative aspects was brought in, and plus infectious disease like rabies was also brought in, and through the interactions with the West, it spreaded quite rapidly, amongst the wild animals, including the wolves. So people exterminated the wolves, and they are now extinct. So what used to be God, what was worshipped and enshrined, is now gone. And in the museum now. So I think I'll leave you with this little anecdote story at the last end. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm so sorry, for technical issues that that we experienced. So that's it for now. I'll stop sharing the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hiroko. Yes, indeed, the presentation turned out to be pretty long, but we understand that there were some technical hiccups that were interfering with the process. In principle, we don't have a great number of listeners or participants. Those who are still with us in this meeting, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. And meanwhile, I'm going to read out the questions that I received in the course of your presentation in the chat. For example, you mentioned that Japan did not ratify 2005 convention. From your point of view, how does it influence on the position of creative and cultural economies in your country? And do you think that it is the available legislation is sufficient to protect them?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Yes, although Japan hasn't ratified, I'm actually trying to promote and disseminate and encourage as much as possible from as an expert here because of the benefit. In terms of the legal, the foundations, I think it is okay, and it is already in the process, within the government, for examinations, for ratifications. So in that sense, the environment and conditions, are already at a certain level, for ratifications, which is okay. Of course, there are some issues, that we have to look into, at the micro levels, to be in tune, to effectively implement the ratification, the convention, so that's one thing we really have to work on, but it's the same thing, it's always just the hesitance of ratifying any convention is always how do we go about how to adapt, how is it beneficial, to a country, so that have to be stressed at any levels, and have to be discussed fully, at any scales. Am I answering the question? Did I get the question right?
Yes, I think that my colleague believes that you answered this question. There is another request for clarification. Do you have in your country any kind of professional associations on cultural and creative industries that are helping to protect the rights of those who work in the cultural sector? And there is another question on statistics. To what extent in your government statistics or nationwide statistics, the data on creative industries are integrated or taken into consideration? We are asking this question because in our region, in our countries, we have just started thinking about the reporting and accountability. Economic reporting, for example, on the number of people who work in the creative industry.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. The first one, about the associations or organizations to support or or monitor, I guess in this case, the CCI, the creative, or the cultural sector. Now, the concepts of the cultural and creative creative industry is still not fully developed in Japanese context, I would say. Although it is the national national interest, and it is in the direction of the national strategy. the word or the phrase, like, the cultural and the creative industries, CCI, is not often used, unfortunately. So that has to be, like, supported and promoted, like, even from the private sector, not just, like, from, like, the public sector, but also, like, from private sector, and also, like, the civil society, side as well, very much. And of course, for this, civil society organizations are very strong, advocate, and the voice, when it comes to CCIs, because of, all the aspects, such as, labor, or the human, or the human, rights aspect as well. The chamber of commerce, type of, of entities, to the arts council. Now, in Japan, there is no national art council, but in the multiple levels, there are, art council, or the council for, arts and cultures, and they are, particularly, concerned, and is aware and conscious about, the creative economy, so they're trying to link these discussions and debate together, at these, levels, but it's not done so, much, by the national size or the scale, organization or associations, so that's one thing that I think we can look into, to promote. There are many, the organizations and associations with regard to the arts and culture and supports and promotions. However, when it comes to the business aspect, economic aspects of it, there's not much of the talk on culture, so that's the part that have to be incorporated. I mean, the reason why I said, the whole, interdisciplinarily, the talk, in academia and also in the business, private sectors. So, it's very important, it have to be the wholesome approaches, I would say. So, in this regard, yes, organizations definitely have to be more conscious, of this effort. So did I answer the first question?
Yes, yes, I believe so. You entertained the first part of the question. Thank you.
Okay, and the second part was about the data. Do you mind repeating the question again, please? It was about which.
Yes, indeed.
This is a question about the cultural statistics. How well the criteria that relates to culture or creative industries are reflected in your national statistical system?
Yes, okay, it's partially done so. Usually, that data, on the creative economy, is done by, mainly two, ministries. One, is the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and then the second one is the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, where the Agency for Cultural Affairs belongs to. So those two are, are the ones that, taking, the statistics, unfortunately, it's not in the category, of creative industry or the creative economy or the sector yet. And therefore, there's this vague, the overlaps, of data, which have to be, solidified, at this stage, to be more usable, actually, in my view, other data, to talk about, creative economy or, or the culture and creative, industry, in contrast, in comparison to the international data as well.
Thank you very much. And the last two questions, this is from Ms. Nazgul Bakaeva. First of all, the presentation, well, I'll ask our speaker to send us the presentation. We will send it to all of us registered at this webinar, and I will also send you a link to this recording as soon as we get it published on the YouTube channel. The second question sounds like this. In your presentation, you mentioned that creative economies and culture important for the countries where the majority of the population is young, one, and urban too. So understanding the age situation in Japan, how do you deal with this country? What would you recommend the developing countries in this region where the population is mostly young?
Thank you very much, for the question. Yes, as I said, Japan is dealing with a super aging and also declining of birth rate. That's another big, question, challenge. At the same time, in the region, as I said, the younger generations. Sorry, for the tail of my cat, which just came in. Sorry. Yes, the younger generation, is definitely the focus. And I, as I said, for the creative, industry, the younger generations, the youth are, the major part, who are taking up, taking up jobs, in this economy. So, as I said, focusing on youth is definitely the key, because that's where actually the source of creativity actually and energies we can see. So in Japan too, there is a constant effort especially now to focus on youth, even in this small super aging society, and maybe that's another social custom that's impacting the very slowness of the change here, but the attention on youth is so extremely important, more so than focusing on older generation who always get the natural attention anyway to begin with. So the supporting the youth groups, especially is one thing that's particularly done so via the civil society organizations, and also now look by the government initiative too, they're trying to look into more to leverage the youth, to protect and promote their ideas. So hopefully, this idea really continues, to support the youth and focus on youth. Is this did I answer the question correctly? I'm not sure if that's the answer, if I got the question correctly.
Ну, давайте сейчас подождем, пока тот, кто задавал
Well,
вопрос.
let us wait for the person who asked this question. Well, a clarification. What are the specific recommendations for the countries of the region? And this is going to be the last bit. Recommendations for the countries of Central Asia, if any.
Do you say a recommendation for countries in Central Asia on what aspects? I'm sorry.
I assume this is about the development of creative industries when the countries have the majority of the younger population. What kind of recommendations can you provide for those countries? Basically, this is about involving the youth into the development of creative industries in the countries of the region or the Central Asia.
Thank you very much for the for the questions. Definitely the one aspects is protecting and promoting entrepreneurship of youth. If they are the ones with ideas, to support them with schemes and expertise, and giving them room and space actually to develop. It's always a challenge for any country or any places or any generations I would say but to overcome the generation gap it is always it is like trying to listen to to everyone's voice or to recognize everyone has his one's own voice. Just like the convention on the rights of the of the persons with disabilities, don't talk about us without us. Like, you know, that was one of the key slogans, like, you know, for people who, push, like, you know, that convention, like, you know, on the person with disabilities, you know, but like, you know, just the notion of it is about us, and we are here, and we have to be recognized, and we recognize you type of attitude, like, you know, is always, like, you know, the most essential foundation, I think. You know, like, you know, and especially for the creative industries, like, you know, like, it is, like, you know, it is so, because like it is the knowledge-based, you know, like a knowledge-based activity. It is the knowledge-based in, like, an industry and economy, meaning that the knowledge, like, you know, there's no border of age. Like, you know, there shouldn't be, I think, like, you know, in notion, you know. So how to leverage that, like, you know, that knowledge and intellectual, you know, like, you know, the property basically, like, you know, if not, you know, if not named, like, you know, is the attitude, like, you know, that we have to change, like, you know. So the entrepreneurship, like, you know, is definitely one aspect. Education is, of course, another aspect too, like, you know, to support, like, that idea, like, you know.
Большое спасибо. Ну,
Thank you very much, Hiroko. I think we are going to be winding up on this. We would like to finish this webinar. We would like to thank Ms. Hiroko Tsuboi-Friedman for spending your time with us. I would like to, having this opportunity, I'd like to thank everyone who helped us organize this whole series of webinars, our translators, our tech support, people from the other offices of UNESCO HQ, who helped us to get in touch with the potential speakers. Miss, we will be able to see Miss Hiroko Tsuboi-Friedman next week on Tuesday. She's going to have another webinar that is going to be dedicated to the concept of museums and how the notion of museums was rethought and reimagined in Japan and recent past. So basically another webinar by her about the museum business. I'm putting this information in chat about this upcoming webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Good luck to all of you and goodbye. And thanks to our speaker.